Luo is a nice strong verb because the lu stem never changes throughout the entire indicative paradigm, and the slot machine pattern is easy to recognize. But not all Greek verbs are like this. I already mentioned some of the problems in the previous video. For instance, if a verb stem begins with a vowel, there will be contraction when slot 1, the augment, is attached. The vowel that begins the stem also cannot be reduplicated from slot 2, and so will lengthen instead. If a verb stem ends with a vowel and a connecting vowel, slot 5, is added, there will be vowel contraction. If a verb stem ends in a liquid letter, the sigma that is part of the future and aorist suffix will disappear. They'll slip on the liquid. If a verb stem ends with any of the stop consonants, there will be consonant interaction with all of the suffixes, because the suffixes begin with sigma, kappa, or theta. I encourage you to review the table of stops and consonant interactions learned in the first chapter. These pattern variations are not the only problem though. The bigger problem is that the stem itself can change. So for luo, the lu always stayed consistent. But for other Greek verbs, the stem itself can change between the different tenses. So because of the slot machine pattern and the possibility of stem changes, we recognize that Greek has 6 principal parts. I want you to be clear on what Greek principal parts are. They are the 6 spelling variations of every Greek verb. English verbs have principal parts too, 3 of them. So for example, if you want to recognize the verb go in any context, you need to know that go can be spelled as go, went, or gone. Gone isn't too hard to see, but went is a totally different word. Greek verbs also have spelling variations, but 6 of them. For some, like luo, the spelling variations follow the recognizable slot machine pattern. For others, vowel contraction or consonant interaction like we saw on the previous slide causes some variation of the slot machine. For others, not only slot machine patterns but also changes to the stem itself results in very different spelling patterns for some verbs. Here is the detailed slot machine that we've seen before. Notice how we didn't put all of the tenses together. For example, aorist is in the 3rd principal part and in the 6th. That's because this is how the tense and voice combinations build off of the 6 spelling variations, the 6 principal parts. In the back of your textbook, there are lists of Greek principal parts. You can also find a list on ntgreekresources.com. To represent the 6 spelling variations, textbooks will use the present active indicative first person singular to represent principal part 1. Future active indicative first person singular to represent principal part 2. Aorist active indicative first person singular to represent principal part 3. Perfect active indicative first person singular to represent principal part 4. Perfect middle passive indicative first person singular to represent principal part 5. And aorist passive indicative first person singular to represent principal part 6. In the remainder of this video, we are going to look at several full paradigms of Greek verbs. You will come to see how principal parts work, and along the way, you will also be introduced to different types of verbs that have some variation from strong verbs, or are very different from strong verbs because of stem changes. Let's start again with trusty luo. Notice how in the top row I'm showing the principal part. Now see how below the principal part, the tense and voice combinations that build off of the spelling variation is pretty consistent. The main thing changing is our inflected personal endings. This next example is a verb whose stem begins with a vowel. This will have issues when we want to add slot 1 or slot 2 to the stem because it will cause vowel contraction. In these cases, a lengthening of the vowel will occur. In this case, the principal part is a little different too. Notice again how the principal parts show clearly, with our inflection being the main changes as you go from row to row. Now this next example is a contract verb. A contract verb is a verb whose stem ends in vowel. These verbs are different because slot 5, the connecting vowel, contracts with the stem which ends with a vowel, thus causing vowel contraction. This is a minor variation between the principal parts via the slot machine. Again, notice how our 6 principal parts, which represent our spelling variations, flow down to the forms below it. For contract verbs, the contraction occurs in the first principal part. In the remaining principal parts, the vowel at the end of the stem just lengthens automatically. By the way, the blank rows mean that forms of this word don't occur in the New Testament, so we won't worry about it. This next example is a liquid verb, i.e., a verb whose stem ends in a liquid letter. This will cause problems because when a sigma follows a liquid, it disappears. It slips on the liquid. So as you can see, our future and aorist suffixes have practically disappeared. But notice again how our 6 spelling variations are consistent as you move down the columns from row to row. This verb is also a compound verb. Compound verbs are a special type of verb that takes a small word called a preposition, adds it to the front of an existing verb, and thus creates an entirely new verb. In this case, the original verb is angelo, and the preposition apa was added to the front to create a new word, apangelo. This creates a problem for slot 1 and slot 2. The augment and reduplication happens to the original word prior to the preposition being added. Notice the green highlights in the table. This is the spot where slot 1 and slot 2 changes will occur. And notice again how the principal parts flow down through the table. I remind you again that this verb is demonstrating 2 different rules. First, it is a liquid verb. The future and aorist, which adds a sigma in the suffix, falls off. Second, because it is a compound verb, slot 1, the augment, and slot 2, reduplication, occurs in the middle of the word after the preposition. This next verb is chosen to teach you about second aorist verbs. You've already learned that aorist active and middle verbs have an augment and a sigma alpha suffix, slot 1 and slot 4. Remember that this is a strong verb pattern, like luo, but there are some verbs whose third principal part simply doesn't follow that slot machine pattern. Simply put, they do not take a sigma alpha suffix. So the slot machine pattern ends up being like the imperfect. The difference, though, is the stem. See here that the stem is changed from principal part 1 to principal part 3. And notice again how the 6 principal parts do flow down to the forms below. So we see with this example that the spelling variations are significant from part to part. It is hard to believe that eichthane is related to ago, but it is. Again, I remind you, this is no different than some English words. It is only through rote memorization that you know that went is related to go. This next example is the same as the previous in that it is a second aorist, and it is also an irregular patterned verb. Each principal part is very different. Notice again, though, that the stem pattern of the principal parts flow through the rows, with the personal inflected endings in the red font being the main changes from row to row. As anyone can plainly see, there is no way you can tell that a word like apon is related to Lego. Finally, we reach me verbs. If you thought second aorist verbs were difficult, me verbs are even more so. The first characteristic of me verbs is that they have a unique iota reduplication only in the first principal part, so only present and imperfect have this unique reduplication. The second characteristic of me verbs is that the stem is generally quite short, and its vowel can fluctuate between a short and a long vowel. Third, aorist active me verbs take a kappa alpha suffix rather than sigma alpha. Finally, me verbs have a unique set of primary active endings. In the previous video, I noted these endings and represent them in the personal endings table. That is a lot of differences. The full pattern of didomi looks like this. Notice again, though, how the principal parts flow down into the tenses below, with the personal endings being the main change. This again has been a lot of information. but I trust that you are at least beginning to understand the process of how verbs are formed. Remember that in this stripped-down approach, you don't need to memorize all of these tables. You don't need to replicate these tables, and you're not being taught how to compose Greek. What I want you to wrap your mind around is how verbs are formed and why, when you are studying your Greek New Testament, a verb may look so different from its lexical form. I mentioned the singing grammarian in my last video, and I'd like to mention it again here. Tap into the power of song to become familiar with and even memorize these indicative verb patterns. And you can also become familiar with liquid verbs and me verbs using the liquid verbs and me verb songs. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. You can find me on the web at ntgreekresources.com, which includes my blog and Twitter feed, and of course numerous resources to help you learn Greek, including apps, songs, videos, software training, and more.